Welcome to Beyond the Flight Deck podcast with United Airlines pilot and investment advisor, Alan Bewley, who will take you behind the scenes with airline pilot entrepreneurs, academics, and other professionals. And now, your host, Alan Bewley.
Alan Bewley here, Managing Partner, United Wealth Management, joined by my business partner, Dan Lohmar, Chief Operating Officer. Dan, how are you, sir?
Good to be here, Alan. Good. How are you?
Good, man. All right.
Good.
Big topic of the day, man. Big topic.
Yeah, lots of questions the past 2 days about the LOA, and let's answer a few of them.
Okay. Let's start out just real quick. I want to talk about just IRS limits in your 401k and your PRAP account. Basically, the first two, annual compensation of $350,000 or the combined contribution limit of $70,000. If you hit either one of those, no more company money can go into your PRAP for the rest of the year. Okay. And then as far as your own personal contribution, the limit in 2025, either pre-tax, Roth, or a combination thereof, 23.5. So just a quick glimpse at what the numbers are for next year and a quick definition just so we can understand what they are. They're going to come up later here in the discussion. All right. Market-based cash balance plan. This is part of UPA 23. Dan, talk a little bit about what it is and how we got here to being part of our compensation package.
Absolutely. So it's the cash balance plan is technically it's a defined benefit plan. So it's unique though in that it has some characteristics of a benefit plan and also a contribution plan. So you're not to make contributions into that plan based on, we'll talk about what criteria and stuff like that. But in the end, basically, it guarantees a minimum amount in there. In other words, it's guaranteeing that the balance that you would draw in retirement is not going to be less than the money that was contributed to the plan. So that's the big picture about it of it. And Alan, I know you'll talk a little bit more about the details. But let's talk about how we got here and why we're talking about a cash balance plan. So all the way back in 2014, in that contract, we started the Retiree Health Account, and then that's funded with excessive contributions that don't fit into the PRAP. Here we are 9-10 years later, and we never thought we'd be seeing the balances we see in RHA accounts that we are seeing from wide body captains and people who've contributed significantly over the years. And so the risk of that is that, hey, you retire with a ton of money in there. You may not spend it over your lifetime. It's not an inheritable asset. Okay, so with that in mind, when we approached UPA 23, I say we, the pilot group, when we pitched UPA 23, said, hey, can we create an option in addition to or as an alternative to the Retiree Health Account? And that option is the cash balance plan is what we're talking about right now. So ultimately, we would love to have the option so that spillover money that does not fit into the PRAP in other places, we'd love to have the option to say, hey, look, I either want it to go into this cash balance plan or into the Retiree Health Account. That's what we do. So when we went to the company in UPA 23 and said, hey, let's create this, the company said, hey, that's great, but in order to do that, we want to have, before we implement this plan, we want to have basically IRS approval before we implement it, because the IRS is very, very particular about the rules within 401ks and defined benefit and defined contribution plans. And so if you're not following those particular rules, they can disqualify the plan. And disqualifying a plan would be a nightmare. Okay, so not only would it disqualify a potential cash balance plan, it could potentially, all the other stuff might kind of come under scrutiny. So we say, no, that's a good idea. Let's get IRS approval. We're on board with that. But as it turns out, here we are a year past the implementation of UPA 23, and we find out, hey, it's going to take a while to get this IRS approval in the cash balance plan. And we do like the option of it. So instead of waiting a full 2 to 3 years or however long it's going to take with our slow-moving IRS to get this approved, we came back to the company earlier this year and said, hey, look, why don't we implement parts of the cash balance plan that are, let's just say they're IRS friendly, that we are very low risk of being disqualified. Can we take parts of that cash balance plan and start to implement that in the interim? Okay, so before it's fully approved, can we start to implement parts of the cash balance plan in the interim? And that's where we are today. So the cash balance plan and UPA 23, it's already approved. I mean, we've
Right.
already approved it as the pilot group. It's just not approved by the IRS, and so it's not being implemented. So our question with LOA is, hey, can we just implement parts of it? And that's what the LOA is about. I hope that wasn't too long-winded, but that's where we are, is we're voting on the ability to implement parts of that plan in the interim until the full plan is approved.
Right, right. And I think the urgency of maybe the folks in the R&I committee or the company or the union is that some people are getting to the point to where they do maybe have unspendable dollars in their RHA and wanted to give those folks some relief, whether you agree or not. That's not part of this discussion. But so just to
Yeah.
follow up on what Dan said, the market-based cash balance plan is a contingent benefit plan. Remember, we had one of those before, defined benefit plan, that was in our pension, but this one's funded like a defined contribution plan. Like we said before, this would get funded after the other limits were reached. Company funds could no longer go into the PRAP, so they would spill here as opposed to, say, the RHA. It is indeed a conservative allocation, 30% stock, 70% bonds, opposite of what a lot of people would want to be. But to Dan's point, the account value always needs to meet or exceed contributions. Two reasons. One, when you retire, you're eligible to take everything out of there. And if you're underwater, if account value is less than contributions, United actually has to plus up and get you even. But the biggest reason we don't want it to be negative or underwater, if United were to file bankruptcy one day and there was and your cost basis was below the account or above the account value, that's technically a liability on the balance sheet of the company. That's never good in bankruptcy. All right, so that's why it's structured the way it is. The last thing we'll talk about, there is part of this contingent benefit plan called a contingent benefit rule, basically states that two people making the same amount of money cannot have a different benefit just because they elect their savings differently. So if pilot one making 350 makes no PRAP contributions, then their PRAP contributions would be 59.5. That's 350,000 times 17%. However, if pilot B also makes 350 but maxes out their PRAP, they would then get 23.5 to the PRAP next year. The company would get 46.5 in there to equal the 70,000 total contribution between you and the company. And then that extra 13,000 would go to the cash balance plan. Pilot A, no cash balance. Pilot B, cash balance. But they both got the same amount of money from the company, right? That 59.5 does not change. We're still getting all your 17%. It's just some of it for pilot B is going somewhere else. But unfortunately, this violates this contingent benefit rule. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about Delta for a second, because there are a lot of people referring to it. So their cash balance plan was ratified back in December of 2020. They submitted theirs to the IRS in May of 23. We have not submitted ours either, right? So it took them a long time as well. It was submitted for approval in May of 23. Their plan started in October of 23, and then it was approved last month, October of 24. So like you said, Dan, what we're trying to do is start it without approval and make sure we started it properly, whether it's the LOA or whether it's the full new plan, either way.
Yep.
All right, so what does theirs look like? Again, the company's max contribution is just like ours. 350,000 up to 350,000 in earnings, that earnings limit times 17% contribution, 59.5, right? So that's the max contribution to their PRAP, their version of their PRAP account. Anything above that's going to spill over to one of two options. They have now the market-based cash balance plan, or that money, that company contribution that no longer fits in their retirement plan just gets taxed and paid out as cash. All right. So those are their two options. But here's the rub, is pilots that were on the property prior to implementation, prior to October of last year, they have a once in a lifetime election. They can either send that excess spillover to the cash balance plan or have it taxed and paid out as cash for the duration of their career, the rest of their career. Anyone hired after October of last year, they are opted in automatically to spill over going to the cash balance plan, and they have no choice. So big picture there, Dan, no optionality.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they're not, they're not, I don't want to say the word capped at 46.5, the defined contribution plan, they're up to the higher limit of 59.5. Yeah, but they don't have the optionality that we're looking for, and that we really desire, which in the long term is a great option.
Okay. All right. So this is our proposed plan long term. Okay. We'll get to the LOA in a second, but talk about for a second our final plan, what we're trying to get to.
Yeah. So yeah. So ultimately, what we want is the option for contributions. The big picture is the option for contributions that do not fit into the PRAP. We want the option to either go into the active HRA/RHA or the market-based cash balance plan. We also want annual. We want to change that annually if we can. That's a great option to have, because now, based on where you are in your career, you can say, hey, I want to put money into the RHA. Once the balance I think is sufficient, at whatever stage you are in your career, say, hey, now I'm going to change it over to the cash balance plan. Or you can split it one way or the other, however you think. And the other option is vacation forfeiture. Ultimately, that's what we want. And so that's what we're shooting for in the long run. And that's kind of, like I said, that's what we in the end want in the long term. In the other way, it's kind of a bridge to get us to that point in the interim.
Sure. And I'll say one point that a lot of people are talking about, this LOA would also be a feature here of the company, of the long-term plan, is instead of 59.5 being the company max contribution to the PRAP, it would be less than that. It'd be 46.5 to meet that contingent rule. Money would still go in your pocket in your active HRA or your cash balance plan based on your annual election, right? It's that optionality. We're going to accept that lower contribution limit to the PRAP account, just the PRAP account, so that we can have the optionality of everything else. All right. And remember, Delta has no vacation forfeiture into the retirement account. They don't have an HRA, RHA. They don't have annual election of either. Optionality, a lot compared to theirs. All right. So the interim plan essentially stops spillover to the RHA, active HRA. Again, they're trying to make sure that money's not unspendable for some of those people that are getting too much in that RHA. It gives those people potentially a year or two to not have to fund the RHA with spillover, and basically swap it out for a couple of years with a market-based cash balance plan. So how it works, similar to what our long-term plan is. Once United hits 46.5 in contributions to your PRAP account, going forward, instead of spill to the RHA, it would go into that cash balance plan. I don't know, Dan, that would start, it's supposed to start in July. Delta took 17 months from getting approval to fully approved, but they started their plan 7 months after they requested approval. So I would think we'd be in this for maybe a year and a half or 2 years max before we went to our full plan. That's really not known, but yeah. So this is the proposed interim plan, which would change where spillover goes, and yes, change the cap of what United puts in your PRAP account. You're not losing the money; it's just going elsewhere.
Yeah. And just to emphasize that the total amount that can go in the PRAP does not change. And for those who are trying to create spillover, you're still going to reach $70,000, $77,000, or $81,250, depending on your catch-up contributions. Those things don't change. It's just that part of the 17% United contributes, part of it now goes into the cash balance plan.
Okay, so a pilot's been reading all this stuff that the company's put out. They've jumped on the forum on the United Pilot Facebook page, and they're completely confused. So how do I vote? So big picture, what is, in your opinion, I've got mine too, what's a resounding reason for an individual pilot to vote yes? Let's just go for a yes vote on LOA 2405.
Yes vote. So, a typical pilot who, let's say I was talking to a client who had a high balance, and I said, "Yeah, well, how should you vote?" All right,
RHA.
so I would want to see that they have a pretty high RHA balance relative to when they're going to be retiring. So, what's that mean? Well, a high RHA balance is somewhat subjective, but like let's just say I actually do work with somebody who has $300,000 in there, and they're a couple years from retirement, and I'd say, you'd be better off to probably say, hey, let's start the CBP up, let's start the cash balance plan up sooner. So that's a good example. Someone with a high RHA balance, or even in their own opinion, they don't want any more money going to the RHA. So that'd be a case where somebody say, yep, let's get the LOA started up right now.
Yeah. And then I know someone that either says, hey, I do want more spillover, or I don't really like this contribution being limited from the company. Again, I don't think that's that big of a deal. My decision to vote this down would be more of, hey, no, I want RHA spillover. I value that more at this time in my career and how many years theoretically I have to go to retirement. If you value RHA spillover more, you're probably a no vote here.
Yeah. Yep. Totally agree. It really comes down to, in the interim, do you want money directed into the cash balance plan, or would you prefer it continue to spill into the retiree health account?
Okay. Because this video is not meant to be tax planning advice or retirement planning advice, we will just say that Fidelity has published a study the R&I committee references to a lot, that most retired couples will spend $300,000. Non-TRICARE retired couples will spend about $300,000 over their retirement lifetime in healthcare cost. So if that gives folks an idea of how much they might want to have in their RHA at retirement, there you go. All right, big picture, we think it's more RHA driven. If you really value more RHA spillover, probably vote this thing down. If you are done and don't want any more RHA spillover, probably vote in favor of this LOA. Bottom line.
Yep, absolutely. And just to recap a couple things that don't change, because I know there's a lot of cross currents of information here. Again, United's 17% contribution does not change. Okay, so even though, hey, 46.5 is under the PRAP, again, the remainder of that, if this thing is enacted, goes into the cash balance plan. Catch-up contributions to the PRAP have no impact on this whatsoever. Personal post-tax contributions to the PRAP don't have any bearing on this, at least as far as we know at this point. And then we believe that post-tax contributions can continue to affect spillover. And then again, the total amounts that can go into the PRAP, again, depending on your age bracket, that this LOA does not change those either. So I just want to point those out, just so there's a couple things that don't get lost in the dust there.
Yeah, and to add on that, the people that are concerned about the cash balance plan being so conservatively invested, if your investment policy calls for 80% equity allocation and now you're starting to get money in an account that's only 30% equities, you can always bump up equity allocation elsewhere so that your total investment policy is in line with your allocation. So even that's not, some people have shied away from this, or even big picture, the cash balance plan, in fear of it being so conservative. A, legally, we want it conservative, but B, you can make up for that elsewhere. It's not I don't think it's a huge deal. Again, back to RHA spillover. Do you want it or not? That's really your biggest concern here. So, all right, Dano, enjoy Thanksgiving, and we'll talk soon.
All right, sounds good. Take care, Alan.